In the aftermath of Nazi occupation in Germany during World War II, a fearsome new power descended on Eastern Europe: totalitarian communism. 1 year after the war, communist leaders rose to power in Czechoslovakia, and after 2 more years, a military coup overthrew the existing government, establishing tyrannical rule and aligning with the Soviet Union behind the Iron Curtain. All contact with the free democracies of the West was strictly forbidden, and any person caught attempting to escape Czechoslovakia was thrown in jail or executed. 20 years later, in 1968, reformed communists took control of the government, and Czechoslovakia entered an era of tenuous peace known as the Prague Spring. This period of relative freedom was ended later that year, when the Soviets invaded and established a puppet regime with Gustav Husak as leader. Husak immediately targeted intellectuals, artists, playwrights, and dissidents. Many, including Vaclev Havel, were blacklisted, banned, and cast out from society. Vaclev Havel used his leadership abilities to give a voice to the Czechoslovak people during the Velvet Revolution, and liberate his country from totalitarian rule. As a playwright and an essayist, he mocked the communist regime, and reached out to the citizens of Czechoslovakia. As a dissident leader, Havel brought people together through peaceful demonstrations. However, after becoming president of post-communist Czechoslovakia, Havel struggled to make politically effective decisions, as they often clashed with his moral ideals. Through his absurdist plays and subversive essays, revolutionary demonstrations, and presidency, Vaclev Havel left a legacy that changed his nation and influenced the world.
Možná se ptáte, o jaké republice sním. Odpovím vám. O republice samostatné, svobodné, demokratické, o republice hospodářsky prosperující a zároveň sociálně spravedlivé, zkrátka o republice lidské, která slouží člověku a proto má naději, že i člověk poslouží jí.
Havel used his intellect to work against the regime, writing satirical plays that illustrated the ridiculousness of Husak's government. In plays such as The Memorandum and The Garden Party, he used nonsensical language to speak to Czechoslovak citizens, communicating with common individuals the shortcomings of the regime. He continued this literary leadership by writing several essays about the faults of communism and the needs of the people. After years of totalitarian communist rule under Husak's regime, several people rose up to become part of the opposition. Vaclev Havel was one of these dissidents. In 1975, Havel decided to take direct action against the Soviet regime. He drafted a letter to Gustav Husak, accusing the ruler of using his totalitarian government to destroy Czechoslovak culture and forcing his people into submission through fear. Havel, after sending the letter to Husak, proceeded to disperse it throughout Czechoslovakia and leak it to foreign papers. Through this bold action, Havel made Western democracies aware of the plight of Czechoslovakia and reminded Czechoslovak citizens that this repressed existence was not free life as it should be. Havel became the dissident leader of the opposition. 1 year later, with the help of several other dissidents, Havel created the Charter 77 document. This document attacked the regime, charging them with the violation of several international agreements. The charter described how the regime had broken international law by disregarding the basic rights and freedoms of its people. Around this document formed a dissident group, known as the Chartists, with Havel as spokesperson.
Havel's role in the charter group is significant in terms of his leadership, because the charter group was not just made up of pro-democracy, American-leaning dissidents. There was a Trotskyite in the group. There were people of all different political flavors. But what Havel was able to do was sort of to take everybody's idea and synthesize those ideas. This is what Havel's close confidants talk about this again and again, that he had this masterful ability to synthesize all these different ideas and to bring them together and articulate them in a single and cohesive way.
The regime, fearful of dissent, swiftly responded with harsh propaganda campaigns and immediately arrested Havel and 6 other Chartists. However, this action only emboldened Czechoslovak citizens, as it demonstrated that Vaclev Havel represented a legitimate opposition to the communist regime. After his release in 1978, Havel continued to lead the dissident movement against the regime. That year, he co-founded the Committee for the Defense of the Unjustly Persecuted. He also published his famous essay, Power of the Powerless, in which he describes the flawed nature of totalitarian communism, and how the power to oppress originates from the citizens, as does the power to revolt. In response, the regime police began to track his every move, and did everything in their power to force him to leave Czechoslovakia. In 1979, Havel was arrested once again, and his new organization was deemed anti-communist and a danger to the country. A few months later, he was put on trial and sentenced to 4.5 years in prison on accounts of subversion against the state. After Vaclev Havel's release, Husak's regime tightened control on their citizens, cracking down on dissidents and further prohibiting contact with Western culture. Meanwhile, Havel continued to write anti-communist plays and gain popularity. In June of 1989, Havel published another manifesto titled A Few Sentences. This document called for governmental reform by Gustav Husak and was signed by 30,000 Czechoslovaks. On November 17, 1989, a student demonstration was brutally halted by the regime police, leaving many injured and a rumored few dead. The news of this beatdown spread quickly throughout Prague and all of Czechoslovakia. The Velvet Revolution had begun. 2 days after the demonstration, Havel founded the Civic Forum with other dissidents. These dissidents came from unique political and social backgrounds, and had very different ideas about how to advance the revolution. Havel became the mediator, due to his unique ability to gather the ideas of others and eloquently articulate them into focused demands. They called for the regime police to be reprimanded, for dissident prisoners to be released, and for all communist leaders to resign from office. A few days after the founding of the Civic Forum, a huge demonstration took place in Wenceslas Square, involving 500,000 people. Havel, the face of the revolution, spoke to the protesters. He reminded them that if they were to defeat the regime, it would need to be through peaceful rebellion. With these words, Havel continued to preserve his ideals for nonviolence, and possibly saved the revolution from spiraling into brutality. In the days that followed the large demonstration, communist leaders opened negotiations with the Civic Forum. On November 28, 1989, the Communist Party relinquished control of Czechoslovakia, and Vaclev Havel was appointed president. Lasting just 11 days, the Velvet Revolution is known as one of the most peaceful overthrows of a government in history. However, Vaclev Havel's troubles were not over, for this next phase of leadership would be his most challenging yet. The Czech citizens, invigorated by the overturning of an oppressive communist regime, had high expectations for the new government. And while Havel was a beloved playwright and a forward-thinking revolutionary, he was not well suited for presidency. Throughout his life, Havel led with a strong moral compass. He believed in living in truth, and developing a set of ethical values and standing by them. However, in the political sphere, one must make sacrifices and be willing to compromise one's principles in order to achieve an ultimate goal. Havel was not adept in realpolitik and struggled during his time in office. A few years after the liberation of Czechoslovakia from Husak's regime, the nation split into two sovereign states, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Havel became the first president of the young Czech nation. Throughout his time in office, he retained the ideal of a free and functioning society, but lacked the political experience to accomplish his goal. Havel made several decisions to strengthen international bonds, but failed to address his own country's troubled economy. In the years after the dissolution of Czechoslovakia, Havel slowly lost the favor of his citizens. Some complained he was too idealistic or elitist. In 1992, he was voted out of the presidency.
There is this consistent theme in his life of being true to himself, and he showed that, even when he was president.
Havel left behind both concrete and abstract legacies. His numerous plays and essays serve as everlasting reminders of his desire to reach the Czechoslovak citizens through literary composition. This idea of communicating with the common people demonstrates the power of the individual to rise up against injustice. Havel also understood the need for nonviolent action, and is regarded as the one dissident who most emphasized that idea during his speeches and in his essays. By freeing Czechoslovakia peacefully from an oppressive regime, Havel allowed millions of Czechoslovaks freedoms and opportunities they might have never known. He additionally paved the way for the later formation of a parliamentary democracy in the Czech Republic and a democratic republic in Slovakia.
So his lasting legacy, I think, is that he was the pursuer of truth, as we indicated on his pedestal. He was a person who tried to defend human and civil rights.
Vaclev Havel changed the lives of millions of Czechoslovaks and set an example for future leaders worldwide. His leadership in Czechoslovakia's fight against communism promotes the idea that nonviolent resistance is not only a legitimate form of rebellion, but often more effective than violence. He believed in taking action because it was morally correct, not because of the projected outcome. Havel was willing to sacrifice his own freedom for the freedom of others, and used his leadership abilities to inspire a nation of individuals. His struggle against Gustav Husak's totalitarian regime proves that effective leadership can be used to either suppress and control, or to advocate human rights, promote nonviolence, and restore individuality and freedom.